So, well, look, that is brilliant. That's a lot of feedback there about different issues that are affecting individual institutions, individuals, anything from staff stress to how do we engage with the students, how do we get them to turn on their cameras, etc. So there's so many things, but as the day progresses, we'll be able to chat about these more. But for the moment, I'd like to introduce Barbara. So Barbara is going to talk about COVID challenges from the perspective of being a dean. So Barbara, are you happy to go on ahead now?
I am. I'm just going to share my screen. So potentially.
That's perfect.
You can see those slides, can you, Joan?
Yes, perfect.
Brilliant, that's great. Joan, thanks a million for the invitation to talk today, and obviously enjoying all the conversations, and there's probably lots of need for us to have many of these engagements as we move forward. So obviously what Joan had asked me to talk about was our experiences. So it's all about sharing the experiences. And obviously I was involved with Alan and Greg in the paper that we did for accounting education, looking at the experiences of faculty particularly, and through them what students were experiencing. And that took place last May to August, as Alan outlined. But particularly what I'll focus on is, I suppose, my own experience, and being clear that it is that. That said, I've obviously been in contact and engaged with lots of others, both in Ireland and the UK, where there's obviously a lot of similarity in the way our, universities and profession and so on are organised. So just to outline, I'll do a very quick introduction just so that you understand my context and the experience, where my experience is situated. Look, as I encountered it anyway, the phases that we went through in dealing and responding to the COVID pandemic, particularly looking at some of the challenges, many of which we've sort of alluded to already, but also hopefully bringing a few more to the table. And some of the lessons we've learned, though I think we'll be in a constant phase of learning and adapting for a while to come. And particularly now, as we're in May, sort of one academic year nearly in sight of finishing, and thinking about the next one, what sort of challenges are ahead for us. So if that's okay, that's sort of the outline of what I'll address over the next little while, and then hopefully we'll have lots further discussion. So obviously DCU is a Dublin City University, so I'm based in Ireland, and I've been working in DCU over 20 years now. It's a young university. There are a myriad of 7 universities in Ireland, and new universities recently established, which have been formed from our institutes of technology. So it's a very dynamic environment in Ireland. So DCU was established in 1980. It was originally established as a National Institute for Higher Education. There were 2 of these formed at the time, one in Dublin and Limerick. Before that, there were only the 5 traditional universities. We were particularly set up, given the time frame, and we were in deep recession in Ireland in 1980, to be close to industry, so to be part of fueling economic redevelopment and so on. So we don't have, for example, a medical school. We have 5 faculties and very much focused on, I suppose, applied and industry-oriented activities. So the business school is a single school faculty. We're one of the 5 faculties in our university. Our strapline is we're a University of Enterprise and Transformation. We became a university in 1989. So it transitioned from being an institute of higher education to a university in 1989. We have 17,000 students over our 5 faculties, and one of those being the business school. We have over 3,300 students, a sort of very common mix, I think, in business schools, where we have a dominant undergraduate population, 2,500 undergrads. We run 6 undergrad programs, one of which is a BA in accounting and finance. We have 800 postgrad master's students, and we have approximately 70 PhD students. So we have 85 full-time academic staff in the business school, about 45 part-time academic staff, and 35 administrative professional staff. Again, not surprisingly, the orientation of our school is that closeness to industry, and that permeates, I suppose, our programs, our curriculum. It's also an increasing feature in the nature of our research activity as well. So not only focused on, I suppose, the academic peer outputs, but that engagement with industry to solve business problems and to translate our research to industry. So it's sort of bidirectional, our industry engagement. Again, like most of your business schools, we're a key part of our sort of, I suppose, strategic mapping of ourselves is through our accreditation and recognition. So like lots of your schools, we're AMBA accredited for nearly 20 years. We did AACSB, first accredited in 2015. We, not surprisingly, given our industry orientation, have the Small Business Charter from ABS, and we're in the FT top 95 European business schools, in the top 300 in the QS subject rankings, and so on. So just to give you a flavour of the type of school that we are. In terms of then my role and sort of my perspectives that I bring to the conversation today about the COVID experience, over the years, I've been head of our accounting department for many years. So between 2007 and 2013, early 2013, that was the role I held, head of department. I then moved and I became the deputy dean of the business school. And I did that from 2013 and was finished up in that role at the end of 2019. So I was just finishing out of that deputy dean role and settling and thinking about my back into my academic department and so on when COVID hit. So I didn't really have much experience of going back into my normal academic role. And then in the summertime, DCU, we had a new president appointed to the university, as was expected, because we have a 10-year president appointments in our system. So we were naturally finishing one president, a new president started, and the executive dean of our business school, so my boss, was promoted to be deputy president of the university, which then meant that I took over as acting executive dean of the business school in August. And I held that role through till March just gone. So through that transition and entry into the new academic year. And I'm now back to hopefully transitioning back towards my more traditional home of accounting. So that's just to give you a flavour, and I suppose then the sort of different perspectives that I've had through the different roles. So I've just said I'd mention the phases that we went through, and I think these are typical of what we've all encountered, so won't spend considerable time. Obviously, as already indicated, March last year, 12th of March, the announcements in Ireland that everything was closing, and we immediately moved out off campus and home for everyone. And that phase from there through to June, I would say, was typified by crisis management, as it was in all sectors. So we were responding, adapting, trying to work out what were the critical things that needed doing. And in our university, we very much adopted a university-centred leadership and management and decision-making process around it. So each of the 5 faculties were very much operating under the umbrella of central university decision-making. Now, clearly the dean, the executive dean of our school, was very much part of that decision-making process. So we had a central crisis management team, obviously organised, and subgroups of that address then the sort of key areas. And the key concerns, obviously, as it was for all sectors and all our universities and so on, was health and safety, maintaining health and safety of staff and students, and how we would maintain continuity of activity. And again, I remember, as you probably all do at the time, those very early days, this fear that, I suppose, at any point in time, our staff, you know, the extent of COVID being experienced or people getting COVID would be such that we could face huge periods where we would have huge numbers of staff unavailable because of getting COVID, or that similarly with students, we would have huge numbers of unable to participate due to COVID. So there was a lot of, in the very early days, ensuring we had backup plans, who'd step in and out of roles and so on. As it turned out, we never got the hit of the amount of people getting COVID, despite I suppose the extent to which we know that COVID was experienced generally, but it didn't hit like 50% of our staff or students, or what had been modelled in the early days. So in terms of our activities then in that period, all of them were impacted. And I suppose you know, the core crisis management team activities focused on teaching and learning, because that was our student focused activities. Things like financial management, campus and facilities and technology management, and so on. And there was a real emphasis on making sure that we got to the 1920 academic year completed, and completed with an assurance and a recognition that quality had been maintained, so that we weren't going to create, oh, they were the class of 2020. Sure, that group of students never really got properly assessed or reached the same standards. That we would assure that these students were not going to, would experience the completion of their programs as was appropriate for moving on in their career. And as we know, that took huge efforts for all of us, all down through the university, in terms of reimagining and looking at our governance procedures over the approval of assessment, alternative assessments. So what governance we were putting in to oversee that, how we would run exam boards, the changes that would go on there, how we would embed or use external examiners. So at every level, there was a huge amount of work to be done. And that was before we considered the impact for the on the ground staff and students, as we all experienced, going from being in the classroom to suddenly being at home. The primary, I suppose, we were at a stage where we were just moving into our reading week in semester 2, and on completion of that reading week, we had 5 weeks of delivery to complete. So that was I suppose the immediate challenge was to do that. And as we all did, I think across most universities, we pretty much moved to replacing in-class lectures with online lectures. So that was the sort of short-term approach to delivery, was to move to online delivery via Zoom. And then we had all the alternative assessments. So there was a huge, I suppose, sigh of relief when we got to that sort of mid-June period, got through the sort of assessment, the alternative exams, got them marked and processed and released, and we were assured the quality of that process. But we, I suppose, were then very quickly, in so many ways, we're back there just in another way this time round, 2021. We didn't think we'd be still doing this, but we moved very much into a planning mode. And again, the recognition from our perspective in our school was that we needed to think about our delivery differently than the emergency delivery, which had just been pure Zoom lecturing. And so again, there was a lot of training provided about alternative types of pedagogies we could use. There was a lot of thinking about what mix of online and face-to-face might we have for September. And I suppose huge effort put in. Some of our activities had developed a rhythm. So research activities, funding applications, student work placements, there was a whole host of things that actually the emergency practices were working well, and they continued. But it was really around the T&L planning, the delivery and assessment, where I suppose much of this effort in phase 2, the June to September, happened. And I imagine it was the same for all of you. Our goal was to use campus as much as was possible in whatever the circumstances would be in the COVID situation. We developed very detailed delivery plans, recognizing that what we did in our university, while we have a business school building, we don't control the use of that space. We have a central timetabling model. So while, you know, business students could be down in the nursing block rather than in the business school and vice versa, but to sort of control movement on campus for when we get back, we got allocated our building to control the use of the space ourselves, and we got some extra teaching space in another room. As always, all the rooms were sort of tested for our 2-meter distance, worked out what was feasible. And what we did was we broke the days up, so morning and afternoon, and we allocated course groups to 2 days, to a time slot. So a day, morning or afternoon, and then we worked out how we would fill and make use of the campus space that they would have in terms of their activity. We did this differently for undergrad, postgrad, and so on. For our postgrad groups, we were generally going to have traditional type classes, but the group split in 2 in our hybrid rooms, so that half would be at home 1 week, and so they were sort of bubbled in half of their cohort, half would be in person, and that we would reverse that around. For our undergrads, the groups are obviously far too big, and what we did was we planned for our undergrads, on the whole, what we called extra nice have learning activities rather than core lecture learning activities. We did this recognizing that, I suppose, that we would potentially be pivoting quite quickly again, that was a real possibility. So if we had too many core activities planned for campus, we were going to have to pivot those. And luckily, in some respects, that was what we did, because 2 weeks before the start of our semester, so we were due to start on the 4th of October, but 2 weeks before that in Ireland, we moved back to what was then called level 3 restrictions in Dublin, whereby for universities that meant only essential activities could take place. And very quickly, we were back into a national situation in that regard. So despite all our plans and them being very developed 2 weeks before we were due to start, all of that was put to one side, and we moved for business school activities back to fully online, okay? Because only essential activities could take place on campus once we hit our level 3, or that was the interpretation, and no business school activities were deemed essential. That was reserved for lab-based activities and so on in science and engineering. Okay, so that was even at level 3. We've moved to a level 5 lockdown and have been in level 5 lockdown for a huge part of the current academic year. So that moved us to the way we worked for the current year, which for our business school, and as it turned out for practically 95% of our university, we were fully online, and that working from home for both students and staff was our new normal. Perhaps unlike in the UK, we would have students living on campus isn't as big an issue. We would only have 1,500 beds on campus. And a lot of students, as a result, didn't actually come back to Dublin. They stayed at home. So they were literally in there. Not all, but a huge number were at home, which did mean there was increased broadband related problems and so on, due to not having the quality of broadband being universal in the country, as I know will be the case in the UK as well. So we had lots of things that did work well, you know, and there are lots of very good successes, and we can be proud of some of the things that were done, but that doesn't mean there weren't huge challenges along the way, or repeated sort of stresses and strains for all involved in the delivery of our programs. And I suppose, given the role that I was playing at the time as Dean, I was increasingly also, I suppose, looking at the broader range of things and how that impacted the business school as a whole, and then obviously accounting being my natural home, being particularly sensitive to how that was impacting as well. So I suppose some of the student issues we've already alluded to, and the ones that were particularly focusing attention for all, was how to best get students engaged, give them a real sense of learning, whether that be in lectures, seminars, their other sort of activities, whether that was live projects, whether it was hackathons. So all of the other sorts of things which we would often have, trying to migrate them to give them a variety of experience. And there were lots of challenges, things that worked well, things that didn't, and Alan alluded to some of those earlier. There was definitely a feedback among our student body, and I put it here as perception of assessment overload, because again, I think there's often variation in perception between faculty think is appropriate workload and what students do. What I think we really worked out was, because so much of our assessment now across the business school and even in accounting, while we still retained the idea of the at-home open book exam, you know, which was going to test some of the technical things, we had a huge amount of continuous assessment. And while to us designing that, they were small pieces of assessment, students were finding it very hard to gauge the effort required. Even if we said it explicitly, they seemed to struggle with the expectation of what was involved. And we definitely in the first semester had a challenge around timing of assessments. So too many deadlines and activities clashing. Despite our best efforts, you know, what would happen is students would be complaining to one lecturer that they just couldn't get something done. The lecturer would move a deadline, and that then immediately clashed with the one that was scheduled for the next week. So we had this constant, you know, with all done for well-meaning, so that, you know, staff and students were looking to modify assessment plans and so on, but we were ending up with some clashes. Now, it required just a lot of oversight and a lot of negotiation by our sort of Associate Dean for Teaching and Learning with programme directors and so on, to just try and keep on top of that. So we definitely had more problems in semester one, and we really worked hard in advance of semester two to try and ease those out. But that gave students definitely some stressors. They also reported that they found the multiplicity of types of material. It's back to, well, what is it we're really meant to do here? You know, oh God, I have to read stuff, I have to watch videos, I have to go to live sessions, you want me to talk about something, you know, that, and because that was different naturally, because we thought variation was quite useful and allowed individuality, they sometimes struggled with how to deal with that. And again, they were grappling with other things too. So, you know, it was, that said, you know, we had some students, we had a business school faculty-wide meeting last week, and we got some students to attend and give them, you know, sort of they give their own experience. On the whole, they were very grateful of the support and the engagement of staff, and I think it reflects the huge effort that went in. But they did find the assessment piece came up again, and they kept telling us they hated being asked to engage in breakout rooms and talking live, you know, so in that sort of sense, they wanted to immediately disengage when they were sent off to breakout rooms, no matter what what the activity was. And they really struggle, not surprisingly, with the lack of the wider university experience. So a lot of our students were remote, very remote as in at home, and they weren't really getting and were feeling that loss of the peer-to-peer. As we've already alluded to, the staff sort of issues, the extra time that was required to adapt our teaching, to work out what was delivery, to learn new skills. There was real concern. All our faculty in our business school, in our university, we only have one type of employment contract. So everyone is a teaching researcher contract. There's no variation. So research, there was a lot of concern about reduced research time. Staff pushing that should be acknowledged by the senior staff of the university at the centre, and yet there was lots of evidence that good research was still ongoing. So it was sort of, I suppose, fear, and for individuals particularly, if they had teaching loads or particular types of teaching, it was consuming effort, and that maybe it wasn't balanced, that experience of reduced research time and extra effort in teaching, and that could depend on group size or different decisions that were being made. So not surprisingly, lots of stress for all sorts of reasons. Fatigue, so all of us experiencing online fatigue, you know, the pressures to be at meetings and engage. Work-life balance issues we've been in Ireland, we were in lockdown from Christmas through to, we're still only just about coming out of our heavy lockdown, but students were off school kids were off all the way through till March. Some secondary school students only went back 2 weeks ago. So there was an awful lot of homeschooling, extra caring going on. And as been reported, not necessarily in our own school, because we probably didn't ask, is in society as a whole, that on the whole, that been borne more by female females than males, that they were encountering more of that issue, and all the normal frustrations. So when we had technology issues, we didn't have enough Zoom webinar licenses, when the VLE went down on day one because we'd been told to embed our Zoom links into our VLE and it crashed the system when everybody logged on at 9 o'clock, and so on. So huge frustrations. All of those technical things we got sorted very quickly, but the missing social connections for faculty, and as it was for staff, a huge issue, and struggling to disconnect. So because your laptop was there, people just keep checking their emails or answering student queries, and that becoming then something that nearly, it just a vicious cycle, that it was hard to disconnect, was being a constant issue being brought up. School-wide issues, and again, I'm sure you've encountered them all. So our student recruitment efforts had to change. Thankfully, in our university, even when COVID hit, we kept our staff recruitment activities going immediately. We didn't drop any of them. So we just moved to Zoom from, I suppose, a head or then a dean's perspective. They put loads of layers. We had to do preliminaries and finals and teaching presentations. So it was consuming time, but we did do that and recruit to all our academic vacancies during that March through to September period, which was great. We were doing a AACSB accreditation. That was actually the job I had when I stepped down from Deputy Dean, and before I became Acting Dean, I was leading our AACSB reaccreditation. Again, we were fortunate, we kept our visit on schedule. So we were due for a November 2020 visit, and we did it in the exact week, and we did it online. It changed the way we prepared for it. We pulled in the team, did a probably smaller number of people contributing to the effort, but we kept that going, and we've kept on plan with all our other ones. And that was important to us. Our executive education activity, we had business that got paused. We had to redesign it. We had to renegotiate with clients, but we actually have quite a lot of that ongoing again. Our alumni engagement, which had usually been face-to-face, that ceased, and that's something that we're really concerned about now. Our industry engagement into programs, we kept actually, we got a lot of engagement from, you know, graduates, employers, all sorts of things, but actually people contributing to modules and to content, we got that a lot easier. Our university kept a lot of initiatives still rolling, and there were times where we were just thinking, really, do we have to keep on this big project? But actually it was useful, and a school project that we actually kept going. So for the business school was our curriculum review. We were due, we've new themes running through all our undergraduate programs around innovation and critical thinking. We had introduced the first year of those in 1920, and we should have rolled into the second year for September 2020. We paused it. We're rolling those out now for September 2021. But we put a huge amount of effort over this period into now thinking about the design of those new themes, which all our undergraduate students do across all our programs. And we had the extra challenges that our government loves, short-term funding initiatives that require loads of paperwork and loads of submissions and ridiculous tightly deadlines. And we had to participate in some of those. They were around job stimulus efforts, but it did draw again off staff, which was a huge issue. So what's ahead for us, and what are the things that are really challenging us? I think it's this uncertainty remaining. What we had last week, we had a big government announcements because we're sort of releasing some of our restrictions. In the weeks ahead, we're not as far ahead in that as you are in the UK, but our vaccine rollout is slower as well. So that explains it. But as part of the Taoiseach, so our Prime Minister's announcement last Thursday to the nation, he particularly called out that he hopes to see, and a big priority is to get students back in third level education on campuses. So we know that that's the intention, but actually all the guidelines that are required to make that happen aren't in place. And we're been told now that it's likely to be June before we will get further guidance on what the shape of that might be from a national and a public health perspective. So at the minute, we're not sure if we're into our 2 metre social distancing, any of those sorts of things. So there's uncertainty about how to plan, and yet we're doing the scenarios and hoping. hoping, given that there's talk of so many other things in society been back in action, that we will be seeing students much more often on campus. We're recognising, I suppose, at a business school and university level, what it has been like to be away from campus for all involved. We have students now who have never been on campus. We have staff who've joined us and have never been on campus. There will be nervousness about that. And we staff who've got, and students who've got very used to not being there as well. So what are the things we might want to do to build back a sense of community and a sense of connection that being in person is, and that we might have missed? It doesn't mean that we will remove all our online related things, but that what does it mean to be back? Obviously, what will our teaching and learning model look like, and how will it be impacted, firstly for September, but for the years beyond that? It's great saying we've learned so much, and I hear this a lot. We've learned so much, we've new skills, we can do online, we can do hybrid. But actually, we generally did online and hybrid and all these things to cope with the year that's in. Nobody sat down, or at least in my experience, didn't sit down with a module and say, I'm designing this module for the best version of it for the next 5 years. We did it, and we've contextualized, and we talk about COVID a lot, and we talk about current issues and all of the things that are there. This notion that we now have these bank of resources, which I keep hearing about, that we can reuse. But a lot of them, my colleagues would say, they're time sensitive in many ways, and we didn't design them in that way. But there's this assumption somehow that we now will find it a lot easier in the future, and the workload required won't be quite the same. What we'll do with our teaching spaces, I think is a real challenge, and a lot of that will be dictated by public health in the short term, but into the future, will it make us think about our spaces differently? And some of the things that I've been pondering a lot on, and would be glad that we have conversations on as the day goes on, is what does it mean, our changes in teaching model for our academic workload model? So again, one of the roles I would have had in our school when I was deputy dean was I designed and ran and oversaw our academic workload model, which is the mix of teaching and research and service and so on that everyone gets. And we have different mixes, and we have all sorts of things, but embedded into that is a way of thinking about teaching in certain blocks, as we say, the standard module, and what that equates to. What does that look like if we're not doing modules in the same way? For now, we've just said, you've got to deliver your modules and you've got to adapt. We didn't take loads of modules off people because it was going to take more time, because we had the same resource base. And that's likely to be the continuation. We have the same resource base, but what the delivery requires might be different. And does that mean we recognise that teaching as a percentage of overall workload naturally over time will continue to be higher? That will be very unpopular, because it's generally seen that it's research that's going to be at the centre of promotion for faculty and so on. So how are we going to grapple with that? For me, a lot of colleagues have been talking to me about fear, mainly, that they've had less research time. So they've put out their, they've kept some research going, and it's varied for some. If you're in big research teams, often the momentum of the team kept things going, but people in different types of projects or different stages with research have maybe had less reduced time. And our research outputs drive your workload mix in future years. So are they going to be, as they would say, be penalised for less output, research output in future years in terms of their workload allocations? And what does it mean for promotion? Again, in our university, promotion is competitive. It's not meeting, a set of metrics and then you're promoted. So it's typically always by, there's X number of posts available in the university and we're into them competition and so on. So the relativities is what's worrying people. They accept and have willingly given the time to their teaching, but what it'll mean for how they're perceived and how they might impact on promotion into the future is worrying many, understandably. And I think there's some of the issues that we're aware of, but perhaps haven't dealt with. And also then, how are we going to manage our departments and schools? And what have we learned in terms of structures? Did our department structures work? Did we rely more on, sort of teaching and learning associate deans and different sort of structures? What worked in COVID? Or what do we want to see? What processes, as Alan said, how has our system developed? What were emergency provisions? How many of those should be developed further for the future? and how do we think about what our schools are doing in overall terms, and how we manage those resources. And so I suppose being conscious of the time and the value that we want to have from conversation, engagement with each other, for me, and having gone through, you know, different roles over the last 18 months and then over the years as well, I think we do have to step back, and it might seem quite trivial at times to be issuing a lot of thanks and praise to students and staff, but genuinely that to get through the years we've done is a remarkable achievement. I know Alan mentioned that and Joan as well, that maybe universities aren't recognising the stress of staff, and sometimes it can come across as platitudes. And I know some of my colleagues have said, if I get one more email about attending mindfulness at lunchtime, right, when I'm actually delivering a lecture or trying to get my videos, you know, that they would go berserk. But certain things that, you know, can help. We did quiet periods where we didn't have university meetings or school or departmental meetings. So trying to encourage staff to take breaks and so on, some of which worked well. So I think we also need to recognise that the achievements occurred because of the huge efforts, you know, of staff and students, and there was sacrifice for all involved, whether that was in the nature of the work we did, giving up personal time, for students had to sacrifice as well. And somehow assuming that this is the new baseline for what's ahead could be very dangerous, because the level of fatigue and burnout, or I know burnout is a very particular definition, but dimensions of that being experienced or reported by many, exhaustion at least, is very real. And how do we replenish and renew, I think is really, really important. And for me, it's that we don't rush to assume we've got a new way of thinking ahead. I think adaptation and continual reflection and learning and sharing of ideas and recognizing that we'll probably still get things wrong and have to change again, I think is what the next period will be about. So thank you for listening. That was a whistle-stop tour through sort of my experience. I think what will probably have resonance with all of you, and in different ways. And we've all played different roles as the frontline accounting lecturers, as heads of department, in different roles in our schools and so on, as researchers, as family members. We all wear multiple hats all of the time, and we're constantly trying to grapple with that at the individual. And I saw throughout the year, it's at department, it's at school, it's at university level. So the issues permeate, and I think at the end of the day, a lot goes for working collaboratively, showing kindness and empathy for each other and for students. Hopefully, are important things that we would bring forward with us. Okay, so Joan.
Okay, Barbara, thank you very much. That excellent presentation and kind of summary. And I'm delighted to hear that as deans, there was a lot of thought and, you know, has gone into thinking about the impact on a lot of people. We have a couple of minutes before, but I just wanted to throw out a few things. I mean, Barbara, I think you're right. I think there's a danger that we don't want to jump into this is our new normal and that this is the way to go, because I don't think that there hasn't been enough research done on it, for example, to understand, do students even like it? What about staff? Do staff like this? So there's all of that. But I also wrote down here, Barbara, that you know, in terms of being careful, you know, there may be a slight, what would you call it? Heads of department, for example, and deans, maybe putting forward a cozy message that everything has worked well, and, you know, not necessarily taking on board the staff views and the student views, and wanting to paint a rosy picture to the senior management, and really the dangers potentially, you know, of not actually articulating the messages that are going forward in terms of this was very difficult to deal with. So I would, you know, I hope that all heads of department would guard against that, and that they would put forward that this has been tremendously difficult. I don't know what the rest of you think about that there, but we'll be going to lunch soon. Could I just ask you before we go off for lunch, would you mind, we like to have our database up to date, and we're in the process of updating our database. Would it be possible for everybody to put their university name into the chat function, and after that, who their head of department is and who if there is an associate head of department, just to do that for a minute. So if you could put in and we can then save the chat. So what's your university name, and then your head of department, and then your associate head if there is such a person. Maybe just do that just for a moment, and that'll help us quite a bit in terms of getting our database a bit more up to date. Okay, so whilst people are doing that, is there any kind of comments or big issues that you think are coming out from what Barbara has said? Anybody like to offer a few? Yes, Barbara? You're okay. Anybody like to offer a few kind of quick comments about, you know, anything that Barbara has said? I mean, I think, Barbara, you've touched on a number of things, you know, I mean, I know, Barbara, that in England, I'm not sure about Scotland, maybe Greg could tell me more, but certainly my son has gone back to university and said he didn't want to stay at home, not because I was mistreating him, but he wanted to go back to have some sort of experience, albeit that it was very little, but at least he got back into the halls, so we had a bit of an experience. And I contrast that with my own students, and unfortunately the most of them have been sitting at home and haven't met any other students, and I think that's just terrible. What about Scotland, Greg? Are the students allowed onto the campus?
They're not really meant to be on campus, but when they can find places outside of cameras, they're having impromptu parties and drinks and things. As you probably know, our halls of residence hit the headlines as being one of the COVID hotspots in the UK at the beginning of September, October last year. And we had a mass effort of trying to support students in halls. Even volunteering to bring up students and to talk about what might be on offer and things. But we didn't actively discourage it. In fact, we did the opposite. And even our postgraduates who, I mean, I'll probably say this later, are mainly from China, an awful lot of them turned up in the UK at some stage. Not necessarily at the beginning, but at some stage, which I suspect has got quite a lot to do with the fact that by doing so, they get a visa to be here for longer than the course, which is probably part of the reason why they study in the UK anyway.
Yeah, I think, I mean, even I know that one of my neighbours, Greg, her son escaped back to Glasgow University there a few weeks ago with his friend, who, by the way, had been living in his friend's parents' house since September. So that was a huge challenge that you know, my neighbour faced there, having to not only keep her own son, but keep another son in her house for that length of period. But I think it is good for the students to have some sort of an experience, you know, because that's a whole 1 year written off, really, isn't it, with having nothing?
Yeah, I mean, our undergraduates are a different situation because about 50% of our undergraduates live at home anyway.
Ah, okay. Okay.
Very west of Scotland intake in some respects. Perhaps it's not quite as high as that, but certainly first year, quite a lot stay at home.
Okay. Well, look, shall we go and have our lunch then? I think everybody's dying to get their lunch. So we'll be back then at 1:15 or there, just a wee bit maybe before it. We could start a few minutes early, and we're going to hear from Greg Stoner, who is a head of department, and get his perspective, which I'm sure will resonate, I'm sure, with some of what Barbara has said, but maybe different in other ways, because having to deal more directly with heads of departments. Okay, so we'll see you back after lunch, okay?